Listen, this farmer had been working his land for 40 years, growing corn through summer heat and harvesting before winter's grip. But when the worst blizzard in decades trapped a family of 5 in their car on a remote mountain road, what he did next revealed why someone who survived the frozen hell of Korean mountains chose a life connected to seasons and growing things. Pine Valley Farm sat in the Colorado Rockies at 8,200 feet elevation, where winter arrived early and stayed late. It was marginal land for farming. Short growing seasons, unpredictable weather, soil that required constant attention. But Henry Watson had made it work for 40 years through careful planning, hard work, and an understanding of harsh conditions that most farmers never develop. Henry was 72 years old, weathered by decades of mountain farming, respected by neighbors for his ability to grow crops at altitude and his knowledge of mountain weather patterns. He lived alone since his wife Margaret had passed 5 years earlier, maintaining the same routines he'd followed for 4 decades. What made Henry exceptional wasn't just his farming expertise. It was his preparation for emergencies that most people never considered. His barn contained survival equipment that seemed excessive for a farmer. Cold weather gear rated for extreme conditions, emergency food supplies, medical equipment, communication devices designed for mountain rescue operations. Neighbors assumed this preparedness came from living in isolated mountain country, where help might be hours away during winter storms. They had no idea it came from 2 years fighting Chinese forces in Korean mountains, where being unprepared meant death, and where winter was an enemy as deadly as any human combatant. Private First Class Henry Watson had served with the 2nd Infantry Division during some of the Korean War's most brutal fighting. He'd endured the retreat from Seoul in winter 1950, when temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and American forces faced overwhelming Chinese numbers in terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone who couldn't adapt to its demands. Henry had learned winter survival not from manuals, but from watching friends die from exposure, frostbite, and the simple inability to maintain body heat in conditions that turned human flesh into frozen meat. Henry was securing his livestock for the approaching storm when he noticed headlights stopped on the highway that passed his property. Not unusual during good weather, but dangerous during the blizzard conditions that were intensifying rapidly. Through his binoculars, military surplus equipment he'd kept for 40 years, Henry could see a sedan with out-of-state plates, positioned in a location that suggested mechanical breakdown rather than a planned stop. The vehicle's hazard lights were flashing, indicating an emergency situation. Henry's Korean War experience activated immediately. Winter emergency, isolated location, civilian casualties likely if intervention wasn't provided quickly. The blizzard was intensifying, with visibility dropping to near zero and temperatures already at -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with brutal wind chill. Henry knew from weather reports that the storm would continue for at least 12 hours, with temperatures potentially dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. In those conditions, a disabled vehicle became a death trap within hours. Using survival equipment he'd hoped never to need again, Henry prepared for a winter rescue operation that would test skills learned in Korean mountains 70 years earlier. Henry approached the stranded vehicle using techniques learned from moving through hostile winter terrain without becoming a casualty himself. Cross-country skis, extreme cold weather gear, emergency supplies, and navigation equipment that would function in whiteout conditions. What he found was a family of 5, parents David and Lisa Chen, with 3 children ages 7, 9, and 12, whose rental car had broken down while driving from Denver to visit relatives for Christmas. They were dressed for normal winter weather, not survival conditions, and their vehicle was losing heat rapidly as the engine failed to maintain operating temperature. The family was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia, with the youngest child already showing confusion and shivering that indicated dangerous core temperature loss. Henry estimated they had maybe 4 hours before cold exposure became life-threatening. "Sir, are you from a rescue service?" David Chen asked as Henry reached their vehicle. "I'm your neighbor," Henry replied, already assessing their condition and planning evacuation procedures. "We need to get you folks warmed up and safe. Storm's going to get worse before it gets better." Using rope and winter navigation skills learned in Korean mountains, Henry created a safety line system that allowed the family to move through whiteout conditions without becoming separated or lost. He carried the youngest child, while guiding the parents and older children using techniques designed for moving wounded soldiers through hostile terrain. The abandoned cabin was unheated but weatherproof, offering protection from wind and snow that would allow Henry to implement emergency warming procedures. Using survival skills learned when American forces were surrounded by Chinese troops in sub-zero conditions, Henry transformed the cabin into a survival shelter. Emergency heat source, constructed from materials found in the cabin. Insulation barriers created from available materials to conserve body heat. Food and water management to maintain core temperature and prevent dehydration that could accelerate hypothermia. "How do you know how to do all this?" Lisa Chen asked as Henry efficiently organized their survival situation. "Learned it a long time ago," Henry replied, monitoring the children for signs of continued temperature loss. "Different place, but cold is cold." For the next 14 hours, Henry kept the Chen family alive, using skills learned during the worst winter fighting of the Korean War. As the storm continued through the night, Henry found himself sharing stories he'd kept buried for 40 years. Stories about soldiers who'd survived impossible conditions through teamwork, preparation, and refusing to give up when survival seemed hopeless. "Were you in the military?" David Chen asked during the long night of waiting for rescue. "Korea," Henry said quietly. 1950 to 52. Spent 2 winters fighting Chinese forces in mountains that made this look like a vacation. "The Korean War? My grandfather fought in that war. Said it was the hardest thing he ever experienced." Henry nodded. "Your grandfather was right. We called it the Forgotten War, but those of us who were there never forgot. Especially the winters." Henry described conditions that the Chen family could barely comprehend. American forces cut off from supplies, surrounded by overwhelming enemy numbers, fighting in temperatures that could kill exposed skin in minutes. Soldiers who survived not because they were tougher than other people, but because they learned to work together and never stopped fighting to stay alive. The thing about survival, search and rescue teams reached the cabin the following afternoon, guided by GPS coordinates Henry provided using emergency communication equipment he'd maintained for decades. The Chen family was cold, tired, and hungry, but alive and uninjured. The rescue coordinator, a former military medic named Tom Rodriguez, immediately recognized the professional quality of Henry's survival shelter. "Sir, this setup, where did you learn winter survival techniques?" Henry was helping load the Chen family into the rescue vehicle, making sure the children stayed warm during transport. "Korean War. Learned what happens when you're not prepared for winter conditions." Rodriguez stared at him with new understanding. "Korea? Jesus. My dad served in Korea. Said the winter fighting there was the worst thing the Army had ever faced." "Your dad was right, but it taught us how to keep people alive when everything's working against you." The Chen family's survival made local news. Farmer saves family during record blizzard. But Henry declined interviews. He didn't want recognition for doing what he considered basic human decency, helping people who needed help. The rescue had forced Henry to confront aspects of his military service that he'd been trying to forget for 40 years. For the first time since returning from Korea, he'd been required to use winter survival skills under life-or-death pressure. But unlike his military experience, this time he'd used those skills to save lives rather than take them, to protect innocents rather than destroy enemies. The Chen family stayed in contact with Henry, visiting Pine Valley Farm every summer and sending Christmas cards that always included pictures of the children growing up healthy and safe. For Henry, these connections became proof that his Korean War service had ultimately served a purpose beyond the immediate military objectives. 6 months after the rescue, Henry received a call from a military veterans organization asking him to speak at a Korean War memorial ceremony. It would be the first time he'd publicly discussed his military service since returning home 47 years earlier. "Mr. Watson, your service deserves recognition. The Korean War veterans deserve to have their stories told." Henry was working in his garden, planting vegetables that would feed him through the following winter. The same cycle of preparation and growth that had defined his civilian life for 4 decades. "I appreciate the invitation." Henry continued farming, but word had spread through the mountain community about what had happened during the blizzard. Other farmers began consulting with him about winter preparedness, understanding that their neighbor possessed knowledge that could save lives when mountain weather turned deadly. 3 years after the Chen family rescue, Pine Valley had become known as the most winter-prepared community in the Colorado Rockies. Henry had quietly trained neighbors in cold weather survival, emergency preparedness, and the kind of mutual aid that had kept soldiers alive in Korean mountains. Henry's approach, practical preparation combined with community cooperation, became a model for other mountain communities facing extreme winter conditions. But Henry's greatest legacy was personal. He'd proven that the hardest experiences of war could be transformed into tools for protecting and nurturing life, that survival skills learned in combat could serve peaceful purposes, and that the best memorial to fallen comrades was using their sacrifice to keep other people safe. The Chen children, now teenagers, visited Pine Valley Farm every summer to help with harvest and learn about mountain farming. Henry taught them skills their suburban lives would never require, but which connected them to understanding that survival and growth required patience, preparation, and respect for forces beyond human control. So now I gotta ask you guys, have you ever met a veteran of the Korean War, America's forgotten conflict that claimed 36,000 American lives? Someone who came home from that frozen hell and spent the rest of their life quietly serving their community? Drop a comment about the Korean War veterans you've known, the men and women who survived impossible conditions and used that experience to build peaceful, productive lives that made their communities stronger. Because here on The Human Stories, we honor the veterans of forgotten wars who came home and chose to create rather than destroy, to nurture rather than kill, to use the hardest lessons of their lives to protect the most vulnerable. Thanks for watching, guys. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to understand that the Korean War veterans are still among us, still serving, still using their hard-won wisdom to keep people safe. Hit subscribe to help us remember that forgotten wars produced unforgotten heroes, and that the greatest victory of any veteran is... And the next time you meet an elderly farmer, a quiet neighbor, someone who seems to know how to handle any emergency, remember Henry Watson. Remember that some of America's toughest veterans are the ones who never talk about their service, but spend every day proving that survival skills learned in war can be used to protect and preserve life in peace. Because sometimes the most important battles are fought in farmhouses and mountain cabins, by people who learned how to survive hell and chose to spend the rest of their lives making sure other people never have to face it alone. That's what real veterans do. They come home and keep serving, just in quieter ways.